Emily Carter almost didn't come to the 10-year reunion, but when she stepped into the marble-lit ballroom, every whisper stopped. Across the room stood Jason Carter, her ex-husband, smiling like a man who had already won. "Emily," he called loudly, drawing the crowd closer. "Still living that quiet little life?" Laughter rippled through the room. Emily said nothing, fingers tightening around her champagne glass. Jason leaned closer, voice dripping with mock pity. "Some people just aren't built for success." Then the ballroom doors opened. A deep voice cut through the laughter. "Is there a problem here?" The crowd turned, and suddenly Jason Carter looked like a man who had made a terrible mistake. Sometimes the past waits patiently for the perfect moment to walk back into your life. The cream-colored invitation had been sitting on Emily Carter's kitchen counter for 3 weeks, its embossed letters catching the soft glow of the evening light every time she passed by. Northgate High School 10-year reunion. For most people, it was just another social event, an excuse to revisit old memories and measure how far life had taken them. But for Emily, the thin envelope felt heavier than a brick, because one name on that guest list still had the power to tighten her chest even after all these years. Jason Carter, her ex-husband. Once upon a time, Jason had been the golden boy of Northgate High. Star quarterback, charming smile, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they wanted to stand closer to him. And Emily had been the girl who believed every promise he whispered about the future. But promises, she had learned the hard way, can fade faster than old photographs. The reunion invitation wasn't really about nostalgia. It was about ghosts. Emily stood by the wide window of her quiet Chicago apartment, the city lights stretching for miles beyond the glass like scattered diamonds across dark velvet. The air smelled faintly of rain drifting up from the streets 15 floors below. In the reflection staring back at her, she saw a woman very different from the one Jason had left behind. Her navy dress hung neatly against the closet door, simple but elegant, the kind of dress that didn't try to impress anyone, yet somehow did anyway. She reached for the invitation again, tracing the raised lettering with the tip of her finger. Jason was hosting the event. Of course he was. People like Jason loved stages, loved audiences, loved the spotlight that followed them wherever they went. Emily could already imagine the scene. The crowded ballroom, the laughter, the old classmates whispering updates about promotions, marriages, and houses in the suburbs. And somewhere in the center of it all would be Jason Carter, still telling stories like he owned the room. The last time she had seen him had been in a courthouse hallway nearly 5 years ago, when their marriage officially ended with a stack of documents and a silence heavier than any argument they'd ever had. He hadn't looked back when he walked away that day, at least not where she could see. Emily set the invitation down and walked toward the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water as the memories stirred quietly in the background of her mind. The reunion could be awkward, maybe even humiliating. Jason had always known how to turn a crowd into his audience, how to twist a story until he came out looking like the hero. And Emily? Well, Emily had once been the quiet wife, standing politely beside him. But that version of her had faded a long time ago. The woman standing in this apartment tonight had rebuilt herself piece by careful piece. Outside, thunder rumbled softly in the distance, the kind that rolled across the sky without ever fully breaking into a storm. Emily picked up the invitation one last time and slipped it into her purse. A small, calm smile touched her lips. Because this time, when she walked into that reunion, the story Jason thought he was going to tell wouldn't be the one anyone remembered. The night of the reunion arrived with the quiet confidence of a story that had already begun to turn its page. The Riverside Country Club stood glowing against the cool Chicago evening, its tall windows spilling golden light across the manicured lawn like something out of a memory that refused to fade. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors while the soft hum of conversation drifted through the ballroom. 10 years had changed many things, but the atmosphere of polite competition felt exactly the same. Expensive perfume hung lightly in the air, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and champagne. People laughed a little louder than necessary, shook hands a little longer than they meant to, and studied one another with quiet curiosity as they tried to measure success through tailored suits and diamond rings. When Emily Carter stepped through the entrance, the room did not stop immediately, but the shift was subtle and unmistakable. A few heads turned, then a few more. Her navy dress caught the chandelier light with quiet elegance, its clean lines understated compared to the glittering gowns around her, yet somehow more composed. Her dark hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and the calm expression on her face made her look like someone who had nothing to prove. She moved through the crowd slowly, greeting old classmates with polite smiles and brief conversations that felt like echoes from another lifetime. A former lab partner from chemistry class, a girl who used to sit beside her in English literature. Each greeting carried a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Some people seemed relieved to see her doing well. Others looked slightly uncomfortable, as if they were unsure which version of Emily Carter they were supposed to remember. But there was one pair of eyes she had not yet seen, and somehow she could feel his presence before she even turned her head. Near the bar, standing beneath the soft glow of a brass chandelier, was Jason Carter. Time had polished him in the way success often does. His charcoal suit fit perfectly against his tall frame, and his confident posture drew attention the same way it always had. A small group surrounded him, laughing as he spoke, the center of the room just as he had been in high school hallways years ago. His voice carried easily across the space, warm and charismatic, the kind of voice that knew how to command attention without raising its volume. For a moment, Emily watched from across the room, her fingers gently resting around the stem of a champagne glass she had just picked up from a passing server. The glass felt cool against her skin, the bubbles rising quietly inside like a tiny storm contained beneath the surface. Jason had not noticed her yet, or perhaps he had, and was simply choosing the moment he would acknowledge her. Either way, Emily felt the familiar ripple of old memories brushing against the edges of her thoughts. Once, she had stood beside him at events like this, smiling politely, while he told stories that made the room laugh. Once, she had believed the future they talked about belonged to both of them. But that version of her life felt as distant now as the music drifting softly through the ballroom speakers. Then, almost as if the room itself had decided the moment had arrived, Jason turned his head. His blue eyes landed on her across the crowd. For half a second, the expression on his face froze in mild surprise. Then the old smile returned, smooth and confident, the smile of a man who believed every room was still his stage. He raised his glass slightly, acknowledging her presence, and began walking in her direction while the small crowd beside him followed with curious interest. Emily watched him approach, the quiet murmur of voices fading behind the steady rhythm of her own breathing. Jason Carter looked exactly like a man preparing to perform. And somewhere deep in the room, the night was about to begin telling a story no one there was expecting. Jason Carter moved through the crowd with the effortless confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in a room like this. Conversations softened as people noticed where he was heading, curiosity flickering quietly between guests like sparks drifting through the warm ballroom air. Emily remained where she stood, her champagne glass resting lightly between her fingers, her posture calm and composed. The soft music from the corner piano blended with the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of glass against glass. Jason stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough for the faint scent of his expensive cologne to reach her, a scent she remembered from another life that now felt strangely distant. His smile widened, polished and familiar, the same smile that once convinced people he could do no wrong. Well, he said lightly, raising his glass again as if greeting an old friend instead of the woman he had once promised forever. If it is not Emily Carter. The name hung in the air with deliberate emphasis, just loud enough for the surrounding group to hear. Several people shifted closer, drawn by the subtle tension that had begun to gather around them. It has been a long time, Emily replied calmly, her voice steady and polite, giving him exactly the same courtesy she might offer any stranger. At the event, Jason studied her for a moment, his eyes moving briefly over her dress, her composed posture, the quiet confidence she carried. For the smallest fraction of a second, something unreadable flickered across his expression. But Jason Carter had never been a man who allowed uncertainty to linger. He turned slightly, addressing the small circle of classmates who had gathered around them. Everyone remembers Emily, right? He said with a light laugh that invited the group to share the moment. Back in school, she was always the quiet one. Preferred books over parties. A few people chuckled politely, unsure whether they were supposed to laugh or remain silent. Jason continued, his tone friendly but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. I always told people Emily liked simple things. A quiet life. Nothing too ambitious. His words floated through the air like carefully placed pieces on a chessboard. He did not raise his voice, and he did not say anything openly cruel. But the meaning beneath his tone was clear enough for anyone listening. Some people nodded awkwardly. Others glanced toward Emily, waiting to see how she would respond. Emily lifted her champagne glass slightly and took a small sip, the bubbles cool against her lips. The moment stretched quietly, filled with the soft hum of the ballroom and the curious attention of everyone nearby. Then she set the glass back down on a nearby table with gentle precision. Jason had always loved an audience. That had never changed. But the years had changed something else entirely. Emily looked at him with calm eyes, her expression composed in a way that seemed to puzzle him more than anger ever could. I suppose people grow in different directions, she said simply. Jason smiled again, though this time the expression carried a hint of challenge. Some grow faster than others, he replied, spreading his hands slightly, as if presenting the life he had built. The crowd shifted again, sensing the performance unfolding between them. Across the ballroom, the tall double doors near the entrance opened quietly as another guest stepped inside. At first, almost no one noticed. The room was too focused on the conversation unfolding near the bar. But the man who entered paused just inside the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted briefly by the light from the hallway behind him. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, and the calm confidence in his posture carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms far larger than this one. His eyes moved through the crowd slowly until they found Emily standing beside Jason Carter. And then, without hesitation, he began walking toward her. The man moved through the ballroom with the calm certainty of someone who never needed to raise his voice to command attention. At first, only a few people near the entrance noticed him, their conversations fading mid-sentence as their eyes followed his path across the polished marble floor. The low music from the piano continued in the background, but a subtle ripple of curiosity began spreading through the room like a quiet wave. Jason Carter was still speaking when the first whisper drifted through the nearby crowd. Someone behind him murmured a name under their breath, though it was too soft for Jason to hear clearly. Emily noticed the shift before anyone said a word. Her eyes moved past Jason's shoulder, following the direction of several turning heads. The man walking toward them carried himself with effortless composure, his dark tailored suit catching the chandelier light as he crossed the ballroom. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and calm in a way that felt almost deliberate. There was no rush in his stride, no uncertainty in his direction. His gaze remained steady, focused only on one person in the room. Jason finally sensed the subtle change in the crowd and glanced behind him, irritation flickering across his face at the sudden distraction. The expression shifted quickly when he saw who was approaching. Even people who had never met Daniel Whitmore recognized the name. It appeared regularly in financial magazines, technology conferences, and charity events across the country. At 38 years old, he had already built an investment empire that stretched from Chicago to Silicon Valley, backing companies that quietly reshaped entire industries. He was not known for dramatic entrances or public displays. In fact, Daniel Whitmore was famous for avoiding attention whenever possible, which made his presence here tonight even more surprising. The quiet murmurs grew louder as he continued forward. Someone near the bar whispered, "That is Daniel Whitmore." Another guest leaned closer to confirm it. Jason straightened slightly, trying to recover the easy confidence he had displayed only seconds earlier. The moment had shifted, though he was not yet sure why. Daniel stopped, beside Emily with a calm, familiar ease, as if this crowded ballroom were simply another room in his daily routine. For a brief second, he looked at her with quiet warmth in his eyes, the kind of expression that carried history and understanding without needing words. "Sorry I am late, Emily," he said gently, his voice deep and steady. Traffic on Lakeshore Drive was worse than usual tonight. The silence around them felt almost electric. Jason blinked once, clearly caught off guard by the casual familiarity in the man's tone. Emily turned toward Daniel with a small smile that softened the calm composure she had carried all evening. "That is all right," she replied. "I was just catching up with old classmates." Daniel nodded politely, then allowed his gaze to shift toward Jason for the first time. The look was calm and respectful, yet unmistakably direct. "Jason Carter, correct?" he said, extending his hand with the same calm professionalism he might use during a boardroom introduction. Jason hesitated before accepting the handshake, confusion briefly crossing his face. "Yes, we know each other from high school." Daniel gave a small nod. "Of course. Emily has mentioned you before." The words were simple, but they landed in the quiet room with surprising weight. Around them, the small circle of onlookers had grown larger, curiosity pulling more people closer with every passing second. Jason forced a polite smile, though the edges of his confidence were beginning to fray. "And you are?" he asked carefully. "Daniel Whitmore," he replied calmly. "Emily's husband." The words settled into the air with a weight that no one in the room could ignore. For a moment, the soft piano music continued playing, the faint melody drifting beneath the silence like a distant reminder that the evening was still moving forward. But inside the small circle surrounding them, time seemed to pause. Jason Carter's hand slowly slipped from Daniel Whitmore's handshake as the meaning of the introduction began to settle in. "Emily's husband." The phrase repeated quietly in several minds at once, passing through the surrounding crowd in a wave of astonished whispers. Jason blinked again, this time longer, as if his mind were rearranging pieces of a puzzle that suddenly no longer fit the picture he had been expecting. His confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said after a brief moment, forcing a polite smile back onto his face. "Nice to meet you." Daniel returned the smile with calm courtesy, though his attention drifted naturally back toward Emily, as if the introduction had simply been a small formality in the evening. Around them, several former classmates exchanged glances that carried equal parts curiosity and disbelief. The quiet girl who once preferred books over parties had apparently built a life no one in the room had imagined. Emily stood with composed ease, the soft chandelier light reflecting gently against the dark blue fabric of her dress. She did not rush to explain anything, nor did she attempt to fill the silence that Jason had unknowingly created only minutes earlier. Instead, she allowed the moment to unfold naturally, as calm as someone who had nothing left to prove. Jason cleared his throat lightly, his mind searching for a way to regain control of the conversation. "That is quite a surprise," he said, glancing between them with a tone that tried to sound casual but carried a hint of disbelief beneath the surface. "I did not realize Emily had remarried." Daniel tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "We prefer to keep our personal life fairly quiet," he replied calmly. "Public attention has a way of making simple things complicated." A few people in the nearby crowd nodded as if the explanation made perfect sense. After all, Daniel Whitmore had never been known for broadcasting details about his private life. Jason gave a short laugh that sounded slightly thinner than before. "Well, congratulations then. Chicago must be treating you both well." "It has been very good to us," Daniel answered. "Especially for Emily." He said the words with simple sincerity, not as a boast or challenge, but as an obvious truth that required no dramatic emphasis. Emily glanced at him briefly, the corner of her smile lifting in quiet appreciation before she turned her attention back toward the room around them. Conversations had begun spreading again across the ballroom, though the atmosphere felt subtly different now. Where curiosity had once circled around Jason Carter, it had quietly shifted toward the woman standing beside Daniel Whitmore. Jason noticed the change as well. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncertain where the center of the room truly was. A server passed nearby carrying a tray of champagne glasses, and Daniel picked one up for Emily. With an easy familiarity that spoke of everyday gestures rather than grand displays. The glass caught the light as he handed it to her. "Ready to head home soon?" he asked softly. Emily took the glass and looked around the ballroom once more, her gaze drifting across the room filled with people who had once believed they knew exactly who she was going to become. "Maybe in a little while," she replied gently. After all, the night was only just beginning. The atmosphere in the ballroom continued to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. Conversations that had once revolved around Jason Carter were now quietly orbiting somewhere else entirely. People were no longer watching him with admiration or anticipation. Their attention had moved, almost naturally, toward the calm presence of Emily Carter and the man standing beside her. The soft piano melody in the corner transitioned into a slower piece, its gentle notes floating through the chandelier-lit room while servers moved gracefully between guests with trays of sparkling drinks. Emily took a small sip from the champagne Daniel had handed her, the cool bubbles rising lightly against her lips as she observed the familiar faces around the ballroom. It was strange how 10 years could transform people. Some looked older in ways that spoke of stress and ambition. Others carried the quiet confidence that came from building lives far from the expectations of high school hallways. Yet many of them were still trying to measure success with the same invisible scoreboard they had used as teenagers. Jason remained standing near them, though the confident ease he had displayed earlier was no longer as steady. His posture was still upright, his suit still perfectly tailored, but there was a subtle hesitation in the way his eyes moved between Emily and Daniel. He had expected the evening to unfold differently. Perhaps he had imagined telling a familiar story about the quiet girl who had never quite kept up with his ambitions. Instead, the narrative had shifted before he even realized it had begun. Daniel seemed completely unaware of the tension surrounding the moment. Or perhaps he simply refused to perform for it. His attention remained calm and grounded, occasionally exchanging a polite greeting with someone who recognized him while maintaining a natural closeness to Emily. It was not possessive or theatrical. It was simply the kind of quiet partnership that required no explanation. Across the ballroom, two former classmates leaned toward each other, whispering softly while glancing in their direction. One of them quickly searched Daniel Whitmore's name on her phone, her eyes widening slightly as headlines about billion-dollar investments and international business ventures filled the screen. The whispers spread through their small group, curiosity growing with every passing second. Jason noticed the subtle ripple of recognition moving through the room. For years he had been accustomed to standing at the center of that kind of attention. Tonight, however, the spotlight had quietly moved somewhere else. He cleared his throat and forced a relaxed laugh, attempting to reclaim the light tone he had started earlier. "So Emily," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw a few nearby listeners closer again. "I suppose life turned out quite differently than anyone expected." Emily looked at him calmly, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Life usually does," she replied gently. Jason nodded slowly, though his smile no longer carried the same effortless confidence. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily, sensing the quiet meaning behind her words, then looked back toward the room as if appreciating the strange symmetry of the moment. Outside the tall windows of the country club, the Chicago skyline shimmered against the dark sky, its distant lights stretching across Lake Michigan like scattered stars. Inside the ballroom, the evening continued unfolding one conversation at a time. And for the first time since Emily had walked through those doors, it was no longer Jason Carter who seemed to control the story everyone was watching. The evening continued to unfold beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, yet the rhythm of the reunion had subtly changed. Conversations that once flowed easily now paused whenever Emily Carter or Daniel Whitmore passed through the room. Curiosity moved quietly between guests, carried in lowered voices and quick glances that lingered just a little longer than before. Emily could feel it, the invisible shift that had taken place without a single dramatic announcement. She stood beside Daniel, near one of the tall windows overlooking the dark waters of Lake Michigan, the distant skyline of Chicago shimmering like a constellation against the night. The cool glass of the champagne flute rested lightly in her hand, while the soft piano music drifted across the ballroom. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the calm of the present. 5 years earlier, she could never have imagined standing in this room again with such quiet certainty. Back then, the end of her marriage had felt like a door closing on an entire chapter of her life. Jason Carter had walked away with the same confident stride he carried tonight, convinced that ambition alone defined success. Emily remembered the silence of the courthouse hallway after the divorce papers had been signed, the echo of footsteps fading down a long marble corridor. That moment had once felt like an ending. Now it seemed more like a beginning she had not yet understood. Daniel rested one hand casually in the pocket of his suit while scanning the room with thoughtful calm. He had the rare ability to make even the most crowded space feel manageable, as though the noise and expectations of others simply moved around him rather than through him. When he turned toward Emily, His voice remained gentle enough that only she could hear. "Are you doing all right?" Emily nodded slightly, her gaze moving across the ballroom, where groups of former classmates continued exchanging stories beneath the golden lights. "I am fine," she replied. "It is strange seeing everyone again, but not in the way I expected." Daniel followed her gaze and offered a faint smile. "Sometimes the past feels louder in our memory than it does when we actually face it again." Across the room, Jason Carter stood near the bar speaking with two men who had once been teammates on the football field. His gestures were animated, his voice still confident, yet every few seconds his attention drifted toward the opposite side of the ballroom. He watched as people approached Emily and Daniel with polite introductions and quiet admiration. Each new conversation seemed to confirm what the whispers had already begun to reveal. Emily Carter had not disappeared after the divorce. She had simply built a life far beyond the assumptions of everyone who once believed they knew her story. Jason lifted his glass and took a slow sip, though the smile he wore felt increasingly forced. Nearby, someone mentioned Daniel Whitmore's most recent investment project in California, a technology company rumored to be worth several $billion within the next year. The conversation drifted easily toward Daniel's work, his philanthropy, and the quiet influence he carried within business circles across the country. Jason listened, without interrupting, but the comfortable certainty he had carried into the reunion was now beginning to erode. Back near the window, Emily turned slightly as another classmate approached to greet her, someone she had not spoken with since graduation day, 10 years earlier. The woman complimented her calm confidence and asked how life had been treating her since moving away from Chicago. Emily smiled warmly, her voice steady and sincere. "Life has a way of surprising you," she said gently. "Sometimes the paths you never planned become the ones that teach you who you really are." Daniel glanced at her with quiet admiration, recognizing the deeper truth behind those simple words. The piano music shifted again, the melody rising softly as the evening carried on. And somewhere across the room, Jason Carter realized that the story he once believed belonged to him had quietly moved beyond his control. The reunion moved deeper into the evening, and the ballroom began to fill with the comfortable rhythm of old stories and cautious comparisons. Laughter rose from small groups gathered near the bar, while the soft piano melody shifted into a brighter tune. Yet beneath the surface of friendly conversations, something unspoken continued to travel quietly from person to person. Emily Carter could feel it each time another classmate approached her with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Some asked polite questions about where she had been living. Others simply wanted to hear how she and Daniel had met. Emily answered gently, never boasting, never offering more detail than necessary. She had learned long ago that the most powerful truths often required the fewest words. Daniel stood beside her with calm attentiveness, occasionally exchanging a handshake or brief introduction with someone who recognized his name from business headlines. He did not dominate conversations or seek attention. Instead, he listened carefully and allowed Emily to guide the moment whenever someone from her past approached. That quiet respect did not go unnoticed. Across the room, Jason Carter watched another small group gather around Emily and Daniel. He tried to remain engaged in the conversation beside him, nodding as one of his former teammates described a new real estate development on the outskirts of Chicago. But his focus kept drifting back toward the opposite side of the ballroom, where the atmosphere had subtly changed. The spotlight he had once carried so easily now seemed to follow someone else. A server placed a fresh glass of sparkling water near Jason's hand. He picked it up slowly, the condensation cool against his fingers as he considered the strange turn the evening had taken. For years he had told the same version of his story. Ambitious young professional, successful career, a marriage that had simply not kept pace with his goals. It had always sounded convincing when he said it out loud. Yet watching Emily tonight unsettled that familiar narrative in ways he could not easily explain. Near the tall windows, Emily was speaking with a former classmate named Laura Bennett, who had once shared the debate team with her during their senior year. Laura's expression carried both admiration and disbelief. "I remember how you used to talk about opening a small art gallery someday," Laura said with a warm smile. "I always wondered if you ever followed that dream." Emily's eyes softened slightly as she considered the question. "Life took a few unexpected turns," she replied calmly. "But in a way, That dream never really disappeared. Daniel glanced at her with interest, already knowing where the conversation was going. A few years after the divorce, Emily had returned to school and completed a degree in art history she once set aside. Later, she had helped launch a private gallery that quietly supported emerging artists from across the Midwest. It was not the kind of project that appeared on the front page of financial magazines, but it had become something far more meaningful to her. Laura's eyes widened. That is incredible. You always had the eye for that kind of work. Emily gave a modest smile. I suppose sometimes it just takes time to remember who you really are. The words drifted softly through the nearby circle of listeners, carrying a quiet truth that required no further explanation. Across the ballroom, Jason Carter heard the last part of the sentence and felt something unfamiliar tighten briefly in his chest. For the first time that evening, he began to understand that Emily had not returned to prove anything to him at all. She had simply come back as someone who no longer needed his approval. The reunion carried on beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, yet the energy in the room had shifted into something quieter and more reflective. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, and the piano in the corner played. A gentle jazz melody that floated through the ballroom like a calm current. But for many people in the room, the evening was no longer about nostalgia. It had become a moment of quiet realization. Emily Carter stood near the tall window overlooking Lake Michigan, the dark water reflecting the scattered lights of Chicago's skyline. A small group had gathered around her again, drawn not by spectacle, but by the calm sincerity in her voice. Daniel Whitmore remained close beside her, listening more than speaking, his presence steady and supportive without ever dominating the space. One of their former classmates, a man named Patrick Sullivan who had once sat 2 rows behind them in history class, shook his head with an amused smile. I have to admit something, he said. Back in school, everyone thought Jason Carter was going to be the one who conquered the world. Emily looked at him with a gentle expression that held neither bitterness nor pride. High school can be a strange place to predict the future, she replied softly. People see only one version of who you were back then. Patrick nodded thoughtfully. That is true. But tonight feels like one of those moments where the story turns out very different from what anyone expected. Across the ballroom, Jason Carter heard the comment and felt a quiet weight settle in his chest. He had been standing near the bar listening to 2 former classmates discussing business investments in the Midwest, yet his attention kept drifting toward Emily's voice. The words were not meant to challenge him, and that somehow made them more powerful. They were simply honest. Jason lifted his glass again, but did not drink. Instead, he watched Emily speaking with calm confidence, the kind that came from someone who had rebuilt herself without needing anyone else's approval. For years, he had believed ambition alone determined success. It had been the principle that guided nearly every decision he made. Yet watching Emily tonight forced him to confront a quieter truth. Success was not always loud. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it grew slowly in places where no one else was looking. Near the window, Laura Bennett laughed softly as she listened to Emily describe the small gallery project she had helped create. Daniel added a brief comment about how the gallery now supported artists from across several Midwestern cities, offering opportunities to creators who might otherwise remain unnoticed. The admiration in the group was genuine. No one was applauding or exaggerating. They were simply listening with interest and respect. Emily glanced briefly across the room, and her eyes met Jason's for the first time since Daniel had arrived. The moment lasted only a second, yet something unspoken passed between them. There was no accusation in her gaze, no triumph, only the calm understanding of 2 people who had once shared a life and now stood on very different paths. Jason gave a small nod in return, acknowledging the quiet truth of the moment. The piano music shifted again, the melody growing warmer as more guests moved toward the dance floor. The reunion continued just as it always had, filled with conversations about careers, families, and the strange ways life unfolds over 10 years. But somewhere within that elegant ballroom, Jason Carter finally understood that the story he had once believed belonged entirely to him had never really been his to control. And for Emily Carter, that realization felt like the final door quietly closing on the past. The music in the ballroom shifted into a slower melody as more guests drifted toward the dance floor, the polished wood reflecting the golden chandelier light like a calm lake beneath a summer sunset. Conversations softened into quieter tones while laughter rose from the far side of the room, where several classmates had begun sharing old stories from their teenage years. Emily Carter stood near the window for a moment longer, her eyes tracing the distant skyline of Chicago beyond the glass. The city lights stretched across the horizon, steady and bright, reminding her how far life had carried her since the uncertain days that followed the end of her marriage. Daniel Whitmore remained beside her, his calm presence grounding the moment in a way that felt both natural and reassuring. After a few seconds, he turned slightly toward her and spoke in a voice only she could hear. "Do you want to dance, or would you rather step outside for some fresh air?" Emily smiled softly at the offer, appreciating the simplicity of the choice. "Outside might be nice for a minute," she replied. "The room is a little warmer than I expected." Daniel nodded and gently placed his empty glass on a nearby tray before offering his arm. The gesture was quiet and familiar, something they had done countless times in crowded places where a small connection made navigating the room easier. As they began walking toward the balcony doors, several classmates greeted them with polite smiles and brief waves. Emily returned each greeting with the same calm warmth she had carried all evening. There was no tension left in her voice, no lingering uncertainty. She had already said everything that needed to be said simply by standing here tonight. Across the ballroom, Jason Carter watched them move through the crowd toward the exit. For the first time since the reunion began, he felt no urge to interrupt the moment or reclaim the attention that had slowly slipped away from him. Instead, he stood quietly near the bar, his glass resting on the polished surface as he considered the strange clarity the evening had brought him. A few minutes earlier, he had finally understood something that ambition alone had never taught him. Life was not a competition measured by applause or admiration. It was shaped by the choices people made when no one was watching. Moment longer before finally turning back toward the room, aware that the story he once believed he controlled had already reached its quiet and unexpected ending. The cool night air lingered on the balcony as Emily Carter stood quietly beside the railing, the distant lights of Chicago reflecting across the dark surface of Lake Michigan like 1,000 silent stars. For several moments, neither she nor Daniel Whitmore spoke. The peaceful stillness outside felt very different from the warm noise of the ballroom behind them. Inside, laughter and music continued to flow through the reunion, but out here the world seemed to slow down enough for reflection. Emily breathed in deeply, allowing the fresh breeze to settle the last traces of tension she had carried into the evening. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the railing beside her, watching the skyline with calm focus. From this height, the city looked almost peaceful, its endless movement softened by distance. After a moment, Emily turned slightly and glanced back through the glass doors toward the ballroom. The chandeliers glowed warmly over the crowd, casting gentle light across the floor where a few couples had begun dancing to the soft music. It felt almost surreal to realize that the place which once held so many memories now felt so distant from who she had become. Daniel noticed the thoughtful look on her face. "Are you thinking about the past again?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled faintly and shook her head. "Not really. I think I was just realizing how small those old worries feel now. 5 years ago, I believed that losing everything meant I had somehow failed. But tonight showed me something different." Daniel looked at her with quiet understanding. Sometimes life removes the wrong chapter so the right story can finally begin. Emily laughed softly at the thought. "I used to believe that success meant proving people wrong. Now I think it is something much simpler than that. It is waking up every day and feeling like you belong in the life you are living." Daniel nodded slowly, appreciating the calm certainty in her voice. Inside the ballroom, the music shifted again, the gentle rhythm of a classic jazz song floating through the open balcony doors. A few guests stepped outside briefly to enjoy the cool air before returning to the warmth inside. As they passed Emily and Daniel, several of them offered polite greetings and quiet congratulations. Word had already spread through the reunion about the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Yet none of the attention felt overwhelming or uncomfortable. It was simply curiosity mixed with respect. Emily turned back toward the skyline once more, watching the distant traffic lights move slowly along the shoreline roads. "Do you ever think about how strange timing can be?" she asked after a moment. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "In what way?" Emily rested her arms against the railing. "If our paths had crossed 10 years earlier, I probably would not have been ready to recognize the kind of life we have now. I had too much to learn first. Daniel smiled gently. I think the same could be said for me. Life has a way of teaching patience before it offers something meaningful. The words settled between them with quiet clarity. Behind them, the reunion continued, full of music and conversations about old memories. Yet the most important realization of the evening had already happened far from the center of the room. Emily Carter no longer needed to measure her life against anyone else's expectations. And in that moment, standing beneath the cool Chicago sky, the future ahead of her felt wider and brighter than anything she had once imagined. The balcony remained quiet for several minutes as the cool night air continued drifting across the terrace, carrying with it the distant hum of Chicago traffic and the gentle rhythm of waves moving across Lake Michigan. Inside the ballroom, the reunion carried on with music and laughter, but out here the world felt slower, almost reflective. Emily Carter rested her hands lightly on the railing, her gaze moving across the skyline where hundreds of glowing windows lit the dark outline of the city. For years, Chicago had represented both memories she wanted to escape and opportunities she had not yet imagined. Tonight it felt like something else entirely. It felt like closure. Daniel Whitmore stood beside her with the same calm presence he had carried all evening, his posture relaxed as he looked toward the water. After a moment, he turned slightly toward her and asked a quiet question. Do you want to go back inside for a little while, or would you rather head home? Emily considered the choice carefully, though the answer came to her more quickly than she expected. She glanced once more through the glass doors into the ballroom, where the reunion continued unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Former classmates laughed near the dance floor while others gathered in small circles sharing stories about careers, families, and the strange directions life had taken over the past decade. Among them stood Jason Carter, still speaking with a few guests near the bar. From this distance, he looked almost the same as he had earlier in the evening, confident and composed. Yet something in his posture had softened. The restless energy he carried before seemed quieter now, as if the night had revealed something he had not expected to confront. Emily watched him for a moment longer before turning back toward the skyline. I think we should go home soon, she said gently. I have seen everything I needed to see tonight. Daniel studied her expression for a second, making sure her words carried peace rather than avoidance. When he saw the calm certainty in her eyes, he nodded. Then let us do exactly that. They stepped back inside the ballroom together, the warmth of the room surrounding them again as the music continued playing. A few classmates greeted them once more, offering friendly goodbyes and brief congratulations. Emily responded with sincere smiles, grateful for the kindness that had quietly replaced the awkward tension of the evening's earlier moments. As they moved toward the exit, Emily noticed Jason watching from across the room. Their eyes met briefly again. This time the look carried something different. Not competition, not regret, but a quiet understanding that their shared chapter had ended exactly where it needed to. Jason gave a small, respectful nod, acknowledging the moment without words. Emily returned the gesture with the same calm grace she had carried all night. There was nothing left to explain. Daniel opened the door for her, and together they stepped into the cool Chicago night. The country club parking lot stretched quietly beneath tall trees, their leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. In the distance, the city lights continued shining against the dark sky, steady and endless. Emily paused for one final glance back toward the building where the reunion continued behind glowing windows. 10 years earlier, she had left this place full of dreams she believed depended on someone else's approval. Tonight she walked away with something far more valuable, the certainty that her life belonged entirely to her.